They thought you would forgive them just like that, as if your dignity was disposable, as if your trust could be shattered and swept under the rug, as if your pain was small enough to be ignored. See, that's the tragic arrogance of people who harm others and expect grace without responsibility. They confuse kindness with weakness, and they mistake your silence for surrender. But here's what they don't understand. When you were quiet, you were thinking. When you walked away, you were choosing. And when you didn't come back, you were healing. There's a line in the soul, a boundary. Cross it, and something inside a person changes forever. Forgiveness is not a reflex. It's not something handed out like candy to those who trample your spirit. Forgiveness without remorse, without repentance, without accountability, it's not noble. It's self-betrayal. And you were not born to betray yourself for the comfort of others. You were not created to serve as a doormat for someone else's unresolved chaos. You are a human being, complex, valuable, sacred. What they did wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a conscious decision to harm you, to lie to you, to discard your worth in the pursuit of their own ego. And now they stand there with that hollow look in their eyes, stunned that you didn't come back, that you didn't fold, that you didn't grant them the easy path to redemption. But what they don't realize is that you were the bridge and they burned it. You see, genuine forgiveness arises when truth is honored, when the person who caused the wound looks you in the eye and says, I know what I did, and I'll carry the weight of it. But they didn't do that, did they? They expected you to carry it. They wanted you to nurse the pain they inflicted and still smile like nothing ever happened. But you're not here to play the martyr. You're here to become whole, to grow, to rise above the ashes of betrayal, not to pretend they never set the fire. This isn't about vengeance. It's about value. It's about not tolerating relationships where love comes with knives, where connection is poisoned with manipulation, where apologies are just performance art to reset the cycle of abuse. You've seen the truth now, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That moment of clarity, that gut-wrenching realization that the person you defended, supported, and believed in was never truly standing with you, breaks something, but it also builds something stronger. It builds a spine where there once was just sentiment. It builds discernment where there once was blind loyalty. It builds self-respect in the rubble of heartbreak. That's the paradox of betrayal. It's hell, but it can birth power if you let it. And you did. You didn't run from the pain. You faced it. You sat with it. You bled with it. And in doing so, you began the alchemy of transformation. You rose not as the same person, but as someone who finally understood that forgiveness is earned, not owed. So when they say, I thought you'd forgive me, don't flinch. Let them feel the discomfort of their own expectations crumbling. Let them taste the consequences of taking your grace for granted. Your growth isn't cruelty. Your boundaries aren't revenge. They are the result of waking up to your worth. And that awakening is sacred. It's rare. Most people sleepwalk through relationships, begging for crumbs and calling it love, but not you, not anymore. You see, when you forgive too easily, you cheapen the very weight of your soul. You train people to treat you carelessly, and over time, you lose yourself in the process. But you made a different choice. You said, enough. And that word, enough, echoed through every room where you were once silenced. It rang like thunder in the ears of those who underestimated your strength. It reminded the world that you are no longer available for betrayal disguised as affection. You are not bitter. You are awake. You are not cold. You are wise. You are not cruel. You are done. Done with the cycle. Done with pretending. Done with bandaging wounds that were never supposed to be inflicted in the first place, because real love doesn't harm. Real love doesn't require endless apologies for the same behavior. Real love doesn't expect you to swallow your pain just to keep the peace. And most importantly, real love doesn't ask you to betray yourself in order to make others feel comfortable. They thought you'd forgive them, but what they didn't realize is that some wounds don't heal through reconciliation. They heal through distance, through silence, through walking away and never looking back. That's not cruelty. That's consequence. And if they truly cared, they would have protected you from ever needing to make that choice. But they didn't. And now you are free. Let them sit in the echo of their decisions. Let them wrestle with the silence you left behind. Let them learn, finally, that you were not the one who needed forgiveness. You were the one who offered peace, and they destroyed it. You were the one who brought light, and they chose the shadows. You were the one who could have loved them forever, but they gambled and lost. Now you walk forward, not in anger, but in truth, not in revenge, but in clarity, because once you realize your value, there is no going back. Once you break the cycle, you become unbreakable. And that is what they never saw coming. Forgiveness is often presented as the noble path, the higher road, the sign of a spiritually evolved person. But that narrative, when twisted, can be weaponized. And that's exactly what happens when someone deeply wounds you intentionally and then expects forgiveness without owning the weight of what they've done. That expectation isn't born out of humility. It's born out of entitlement. They don't want to carry the consequences of their behavior. They want you to carry them. They want you to do the emotional labor of healing a wound they inflicted, and they want you to do it quietly. But here's the brutal truth. Forgiving someone who refuses to be accountable for their actions isn't a virtue. It's a betrayal of yourself. It's an abandonment of your own dignity. You cannot build peace on a foundation of lies and denial. You cannot reconcile with someone who still refuses to admit they shattered something sacred. Forgiveness in the absence of responsibility does not heal. It festers. It eats away at you from the inside because deep down you know you're giving something precious to someone who hasn't earned it. And worse, they don't even see the need to. They gaslight you with spiritual sounding platitudes. You're still holding on, or you need to let go, as if you're the problem for feeling the pain, as if the wound was just your overreaction. But this is where your strength must rise, because your pain is not irrational. Your sense of betrayal is not an illusion. When someone violates your trust, dismisses your voice, and crushes your spirit with no remorse, they have declared war on your soul. And it is not your job to repair what they willingly destroyed. You are not a machine that can simply reset. You are a complex, thinking, feeling being. You invested your love, your time, your belief into someone who treated it all like it was disposable. And now they want the benefits of forgiveness without the discomfort of growth. They want your mercy without offering their truth. That's not healing, that's manipulation, that's emotional theft. Real forgiveness is not passive. It is not something that happens by default. It is active, it is earned, it is carved out through deep acknowledgement of harm, genuine remorse, and an honest commitment to change. Anything less than that is counterfeit. And counterfeit forgiveness only delays your healing. It silences your pain and teaches others that they can wound you without consequence. That's not peace, that's suppression. That's a lie you tell yourself to avoid confrontation, but the soul knows, it always knows. And if you choose to forgive without accountability, the voice in your own conscience will start to grow quiet because you're training it not to matter. You're training yourself to ignore your own boundaries, and you become complicit in your own devaluation. That's how people lose themselves. That's how you become someone who is constantly bleeding for others, who never stop cutting. But you don't have to walk that road anymore. You've woken up. You've seen what it costs to forgive people who never say, "I'm sorry," and mean it. You've carried pain that didn't belong to you. You've played peacemaker in a war you didn't start. And now something in you is done. Done with shrinking, done with pretending, done with bandaging bullet wounds with smiles. You've come to understand that protecting your peace sometimes means withholding forgiveness, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. You see, they thought you were naive. They thought you'd just roll over like before. But this time, something shifted. This time, you said no. Not because you hate them, not because you want revenge, but because you finally love yourself enough to stop betraying your own soul. And that no, spoken quietly or perhaps even silently, is the most powerful declaration of self-worth you have ever made. Now, they don't understand you. Now they say you've changed, but you haven't changed. You've simply returned to your senses. You've remembered who you are, and who you are is someone who deserves truth, not excuses, accountability, not empty words, effort, not entitlement. You're not here to carry the burden of someone else's growth. You're here to rise in your own truth, even if that means walking away from people who once meant the world to you. Forgiveness is beautiful, but it is not blind. It is not something to be handed out like a trophy for surviving abuse. It is a sacred exchange, and it must be mutual. If not, it becomes toxic. It becomes a chain, and chains are not signs of strength. They're signs of captivity. You were not born to be captive to anyone's guilt. You were born to walk in truth, and truth, more often than not, requires distance. So hold your head high. You did not fail by refusing to forgive someone who never earned it. You honored yourself. You listened to your pain. You learned the difference between grace and self-erasure. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. And that wisdom will protect you from future betrayals. It will guide you toward people who will not only respect your forgiveness, but never demand it without first offering their own repentance. They thought you would forgive them after what they did, but now they understand. You're not who you used to be. You are stronger, wiser, and finally free. Healing does not always begin with reconciliation. Sometimes it begins with distance, with silence, with choosing to step away rather than to stay and endlessly explain the pain they refuse to understand. You see, there comes a moment deep in the soul when you realize that no apology is coming, no admission of guilt, no ownership of the damage they caused. And in that moment, you're faced with a choice. Either you keep circling the same emotional battlefield hoping for peace, or you walk away and build peace yourself on your own terms. And walking away, though terrifying, is the first real act of self-healing, because it signals to your subconscious that you're no longer available for betrayal. You're no longer willing to be the one who holds the relationship together with bleeding hands. That distance, that decision to remove yourself from a place of emotional corrosion is not avoidance. It's strength. It's maturity. It's the recognition that not all wounds are healed in the presence of the person who caused them. In fact, some wounds only begin to heal once that person is gone. You didn't walk away to punish them. You walked away to protect yourself, to breathe, to feel your own thoughts again without the constant weight of confusion, blame, and emotional manipulation. Because let's be honest, when someone hurts you deeply and then acts as if you owe them your understanding, it creates a psychological prison. And in that prison, you doubt yourself, you shrink, you replay the events over and over, trying to make sense of something that was senseless. That's what they want. They want you trapped in the loop of over-explaining your pain while they refuse to take responsibility for inflicting it. But once you create distance, the fog lifts. You begin to hear your own voice again, not the one distorted by their narrative, but your true voice, the one that was silenced for far too long. You begin to remember what it feels like to exist without walking on eggshells, without constantly bracing yourself for the next emotional ambush. That distance becomes sacred ground, a place where you start to reclaim parts of yourself that you lost while trying to be understanding to someone who showed you no understanding at all. And here's what they didn't expect. They thought you'd crumble. They thought without their presence, you'd fall apart. But instead, you found space to breathe, to feel, to grieve honestly, without having to explain your sadness to someone who invalidated it. That's the strange power of walking away. You finally give your pain room to speak. And when pain is allowed to speak, healing begins. That silence you gave them, it wasn't empty. It was full of transformation. While they were waiting for a text, you were learning to sleep again. While they were preparing their next excuse, you were learning how to live without anxiety as a default state. While they were rehearsing their charm, you were rediscovering your strength. That space between you became a mirror, and in it, you didn't just see the scars, you saw the survivor. And the more you stayed away, the clearer everything became. You saw the patterns, the manipulation, the way they twisted the story to suit themselves, and more importantly, you saw how much you tolerated just to keep a connection that was never mutual. That clarity is painful, but it's also liberating, because now you don't just miss them, you remember why you left. You remember the sleepless nights, the quiet tears, the emotional exhaustion. You remember the version of yourself that was fading, trying to fix something that broke you in the process. They thought they could hurt you, leave you fractured, and then walk back into your life when it was convenient. But what they didn't understand is that you weren't just healing, you were rebuilding, and you weren't rebuilding yourself into someone who could take more pain. You were rebuilding into someone who no longer accepts it as love. That distance helped you distinguish between connection and captivity, between affection and control, between apology and manipulation. When you chose space, you were choosing your future, a future where you no longer normalize chaos, where you don't need to be needed in order to feel worthy, where your peace is no longer up for negotiation. And yes, there are lonely moments. There are nights where the silence feels deafening. But even in that silence, you're safe. You're not being lied to. You're not being guilted. You're not being diminished. And that safety is the seed of true healing. Healing requires time, but more than time, it requires environment. Just like a wound will not close in a place full of poison, your emotional wounds won't close around people who refuse to change. So you made the right decision. You removed yourself from what was destroying you. And every day you maintain that distance, you are choosing yourself, choosing your sanity, choosing a life that reflects your worth instead of reducing it. They thought you'd come back. They thought you'd forgive, forget, and fold like you did before. But they underestimated the transformation that happens in solitude. They didn't account for the strength that silence can forge, because while they were comfortable in the old dynamic, you were becoming someone new, someone who no longer begs to be heard, but simply walks away when they're not. And now they're confused. They reach out and get nothing back, but that's not indifference. That's protection. That's growth. That's you choosing healing over history, choosing self-worth over second chances, choosing distance not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to stop bleeding for those who never brought a bandage. That space you created, it saved you. And one day, when the echoes of their actions catch up to them, they'll realize the truth. Losing access to someone who was healing in silence is one of the greatest losses they'll ever face. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The way someone can betray you, wound you, fracture your trust, and then, with a straight face and shallow apology, expect forgiveness like it's automatic, as if the slate should be wiped clean without any meaningful attempt to repair the damage. That expectation doesn't come from a place of remorse. It comes from a place of entitlement. They don't miss you because they've changed. They miss the benefits of your presence, your loyalty, your empathy. They want back into your life, but not into the truth. They want access, not accountability. Their expectation of your forgiveness is the clearest evidence that they don't understand what they did to you. Or worse, they do understand, but they believe your compassion will override your memory, that your softness will suffocate your self-respect, that you'll return to the same place where you were broken just because they finally decided to look your way again. But this is the defining line between emotional maturity and moral laziness. The person who wrongs you and owns it is rare. The person who wrongs you and demands grace is common. And that's exactly the pattern they've shown. They didn't apologize with their actions. They didn't reflect. They didn't ask what the pain did to you. No, they waited. They waited just long enough for the storm to pass, hoping your boundaries would weaken. And when they came back, they didn't bring humility. They brought excuses. They tried to rewrite history, to paint their cruelty as confusion, their betrayal as a misunderstanding, their intentional damage as accidental fallout. And through it all, the unspoken message was clear. You're the kind of person who forgives, right? So forgive me. But true forgiveness cannot coexist with deception. It cannot live in an environment where the offender is more interested in comfort than in character. If they were truly remorseful, they wouldn't expect forgiveness. They would earn it. They would show it. They would sit in the discomfort of what they caused, not try to fast forward through it for their own relief. Their expectation reveals their heart more than their words ever could. And what it reveals is this: they're not sorry they did it. They're sorry they're experiencing the consequences, and consequences are exactly what they tried to avoid by appealing to your empathy. That's the playbook for people who hurt you but never intend to change. Manipulate your goodness, weaponize your integrity, twist your values into submission. They'll say things like, "You've changed, you're cold now, and I never thought you'd turn your back on me." But they never once said, "I take full responsibility," or "How can I repair the pain I caused?" Because this was never about right and wrong for them. It was about access and control. You were the light they took for granted, and now they want to bask in its warmth again, but without stepping into accountability. And the sad reality is, they expected you to be the same person you were before they shattered your trust. But pain has a way of growing people. And you did grow. You became wiser, stronger, more discerning. You learned the high cost of keeping people in your life who only know how to take. And so now, when they reach for your forgiveness like it's theirs by default, they find something terrifying: your silence, your distance, your refusal to play the same game. Because you've come to understand something vital: that forgiveness without recognition is not healing, it's gaslighting. It's standing in front of the wreckage they caused and pretending it never happened. And you won't do that anymore. You won't abandon your truth for someone who wouldn't even acknowledge it. They may label that as bitterness, but it's not. It's clarity. You've stopped confusing loyalty with self-neglect. You've stopped assuming that your responsibility is to make other people comfortable, even when they were the source of your suffering. They thought you would forgive them, not because they earned it, but because they thought they still had control over your heart. That's what stings them now, not just your refusal to forgive, but your refusal to beg, to explain, to validate their version of events. You owe them none of that. What they want is emotional amnesty. What they need is accountability. And until they make that journey, they will never understand why the door no longer opens. You didn't become heartless. You became honest. You didn't become cold. You became cautious. You didn't become cruel. You became clear. Clear on who you are, clear on what you deserve, and clear on what real forgiveness looks like, because real forgiveness is never divorced from truth. It flows from recognition, not rehearsed apologies. It's built on changed behavior, not just regret for consequences. And so you choose distance, not out of hatred, but out of respect for yourself, for your growth, and for the lessons that pain taught you. Because the person who truly regrets what they did will never expect your forgiveness. They will feel they don't deserve it. That humility, that genuine grief for hurting someone they love is what opens the door to redemption. Anything less is a manipulation wrapped in charm. You were willing to forgive, truly, but not like this. Not through pressure, not through guilt, not through shallow words that never touched the soul. You needed truth. You needed someone to sit with your pain, not sidestep it. But they didn't show up for that. They only showed up when they realized what they lost. And by then, you had already risen, not in rage, but in resolve. Let them think what they want. Let them spin the story to make themselves the victim. You don't owe them your peace. You owe yourself your protection. Because some forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken. It's shown in the life you live without them, in the strength you've built, in the standards you've raised. That is the final word, and it's louder than anything they ever said. Walking away is often misunderstood. They call it cold, they call it cruel. They say you gave up too easily, that you let go instead of trying harder. But what they don't see, what they refuse to see, is how hard you tried. How long you stayed in a situation that chipped away at your spirit, hoping for change that never came. You weren't the one who walked away first. They did. The moment they chose to harm you, to lie to you, to manipulate you, that's when the real abandonment began. You simply chose to stop betraying yourself by staying in the aftermath. Clarity comes like lightning. At first, there's confusion. You're overwhelmed by noise, excuses, guilt trips, charm. They pull on every emotional string to keep you tethered to dysfunction. But the storm always passes. And when it does, What's left is a terrifyingly simple truth. They never intended to love you the way you needed. They wanted your devotion, your energy, your loyalty, but not your boundaries. They wanted your silence, not your truth, your forgiveness, not your healing. So walking away wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It was about finally listening to the voice inside that had been whispering, "This is not where you belong." You left not because you were hard or unfeeling, but because you finally realized that staying would cost you everything: your peace, your confidence, your sense of self. People love to romanticize forgiveness as the ultimate act of love, but true self-respect, real strength, often looks like distance. Sometimes the greatest act of healing is not turning the other cheek. It's turning your back and walking away from people who treated you like you were disposable. They'll tell others that you changed, that you were heartless, that you gave up on them, but they won't tell the part where they broke you and expected you to rebuild yourself in the same environment that destroyed you. They won't say how many times you stayed quiet just to keep the peace, how many times you justified their behavior just to hold the relationship together. Because admitting that would mean taking responsibility, and responsibility is the one thing they never wanted. But you see clearly now, and that clarity is unshakable. You're not angry, you're not bitter, you're done. Done explaining your pain to people committed to misunderstanding it. Done defending your decision to leave a situation that was never safe to begin with. Walking away isn't cruelty, it's closure, not the closure they demand, but the closure you gave yourself when they refused to change. You didn't slam the door, you closed it gently, quietly, with a heart full of truth. And now they stand on the other side confused because they thought you'd always be there. They thought they could cross the line 1,000 times and you'd still meet them with open arms. But you finally understood that love without respect is just a performance, a mask, a transaction where you keep giving and they keep taking, and what they feared most, your independence, became your freedom. They expected you to crumble, to chase, to bend. Instead, you became a version of yourself they never thought possible, grounded, unshaken, untouchable. That kind of strength terrifies people who rely on control to feel powerful, because your composure is louder than any argument, any breakdown, any emotional outburst. You didn't need to scream to be heard. Your silence said everything. You are not the villain for protecting your peace. You are not unkind for refusing to go back to the place that made you question your worth. What you are is finally aware of what you deserve, of what love actually feels like, of how valuable your energy really is. You're not running from conflict. You're choosing a new kind of life, one rooted in truth, stability, and deep internal alignment. And the ones who lost access to you because they refused to change will feel the absence like a slow echo in every room they sit in, because what they lost wasn't just your presence. They lost someone who would have given them everything had they only chosen to protect it. And maybe they'll reflect. Maybe they won't. That's not your concern anymore. Your responsibility is no longer fixing others at the cost of your own well-being. Your path now is peace. It's elevation. It's becoming so aligned with your values that you'd rather walk alone than be surrounded by those who only show up when it benefits them. That's not loneliness. That's liberation, because there is something profoundly powerful about walking away, not in anger, but in truth. When you walk away, not to hurt someone, but to honor yourself, you reclaim the parts of you they thought they could destroy. Let them talk. Let them twist the narrative. Let them believe whatever they need to in order to avoid facing the mirror. You don't owe anyone the version of you that sacrificed peace just to be understood. You don't owe them access to the healed version of the person they broke. You moved on, not because you were cold, but because you were finally clear. And that clarity, that is what will carry you forward into a life where your soul is safe, your mind is calm, and your heart is finally home. When you walk away in clarity and self-respect, something remarkable happens. Your energy begins to return. Your nervous system, once hijacked by constant emotional tension, starts to regulate. You begin to breathe deeper. You sleep better. The world that once felt like a battleground starts to resemble peace again. And it's in that quiet, far from their chaos, that you begin to realize just how toxic the environment had become, how often you were just surviving in the name of love, how many times you second-guessed yourself just to preserve something that was never mutual. The act of walking away isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't have to be some dramatic explosion or angry declaration. It can be a quiet withdrawal, a soft closing of the door, a calm refusal to keep explaining your worth to someone who's made it clear they can't see it. That's what they never expected. They thought if they pushed you hard enough, wore you down long enough, you'd stay. You always had. But this time you changed, not for them, but for you. Because you finally understood love without safety is not love, affection without respect is manipulation, words without action are noise. You left behind a cycle, a pattern, a slow erosion of your spirit, and you walked away not to prove anything, but to preserve everything. Your dignity, your peace, your voice. That voice, once silenced by guilt and emotional confusion, has grown louder in their absence. You speak to yourself with compassion now. You set boundaries without guilt. You honor your feelings instead of stuffing them down. And while they may try to return with apologies or nostalgia, you now see the game for what it is. Forgiveness may still come, but it will not come cheaply. It will not come without true repentance, without accountability, without changed behavior, because you've raised the price of your presence. You've come to understand that not everyone deserves a second chance at your soul just because they miss what they once had. What they had was rare, it was sincere, it was irreplaceable, but they destroyed it. And now they suffer not just because you're gone, but because they know they caused it. That is the consequence they never prepared for. The silent punishment of watching you thrive without them, of seeing you rebuild without reaching back. That space you created, that boundary you enforced, becomes the very thing that reveals the magnitude of their loss. And the most powerful thing of all, you didn't return to prove your strength. You moved forward in quiet certainty, knowing that your healing no longer depends on their apology. You walked away not just from them, but toward yourself, toward the life you were always meant to live. And that life, it begins with peace. And peace begins with never looking back.